And do you have anything else to say on that, Gary, especially around like kind of that kind of congruency?
Yeah, and this is something that we actually kind of use in our everyday language a little bit, in the sense that what you basically want to achieve as you move towards self-actualization is that there's more and more of an overlap between who you actually are, or who you see yourself as, or who you see yourself as, and your ideal self. Okay. And this would be referred to as congruence. Okay. So Carl Rogers used to talk about this. He's a book called On Being a Person, I believe, and he talks about congruence. Okay. So you could look at someone who's incongruent if they had an idea of themselves that they'd like to be, the person they would like to be, and they're basically not doing any of it, you know. So they feel that being healthy, being fit, being strong, um, reading regularly, you know, loving their neighbor, etc., that all these things were ideals that they'd like to be aiming at, but they weren't actually actualizing it, any of it.
Or they might even notice that, like, and we've talked about it before, they're like, oh, I view myself as someone who's clear-minded or, you know, good and under pressure or whatever. And then when they aren't looking after some of these baseline needs, they're not that person, you know? So it might not be a case that they're like, oh, I should be doing these things and I'm not doing these things. They might notice that this is the person that I see myself as. And then when I don't do these things, I'm actually not that person. And again, a classic example is like nobody is their best self when they're hungry, you know, they're really starving. Like you're not putting forth your best effort into the world as a result.
100%. And that happens to me in my own life as well, like during exam periods, for example, when I know I'm not able to tend to my nutrition, my training, my sleep, my recovery, etc., as well. While I'm satisfying, you know, my, let's say, cognitive needs by studying lots, I'm actually missing out on some of my basic physiological needs. And it leads to this sense of incongruence because I'm not my ideal self at that point in time. So that's just, again, another example of how you can move towards incongruence. And I think the important thing is really important is to actually have some idea of what that ideal self looks like. It doesn't have to be perfect. And this is a really important thing, because when looking at congruence, you're looking at a Venn diagram, two intersecting circles, your self, true self, or your self image, your idea of yourself, and then your ideal self. So the person that you're really aiming at. They're the two circles. And you want to try to maximize the overlap between the two, but it's never going to be perfect. Okay. If it was perfect, you would effectively be God, because you would have attained everything. Okay. It's not going to be perfect, but you want to try to maximize the overlap between the two. And ultimately, your ideal should be high enough that it wouldn't permit overlap. Because the other thing is, you could have a fantastic ideal and have it 100% achieved. And like I said, yeah, you have just become God. Or you could have basically no ideal at all. And your ideal is basically whatever you are at the moment. And then you're aiming at nothing. And then you're not moving forward. So that's not great either. So what you want is that you have some ideal self that you feel would be worth aiming at, that if someone else was to achieve, you'd be like, wow, that's a person I really look up to. It could be someone that exists. It could be someone that doesn't exist. It could be an amalgamation of multiple different people in the way that they live. But it is really worth giving some thought to that, because it helps you to make decisions. It helps you to make health decisions, financial decisions, career decisions, etc. Because if there's something that would take you away from that ideal self, it might take you away from that sense of congruence, that pursuit of self-actualization, and it's probably not great. So start with a general idea, and then you can tweak it over time, while appreciating that you don't need to have 100% on everything. You know, you don't need to know exactly what you want your salary to be, but you might want to be able to provide for your children, for example. Just have some idea.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to that first episode we did this year in terms of goal setting. Like it sounds like, oh, so foundational, like, oh, it's just goal setting. But like if you actually spend the time to sit down and think, who do you actually want to be? You know, and as we talked about in that episode, I think it was, you know, do it in the next 5 years. Yeah, what do you want to do in the next 5 years? But then also look at it from your deathbed and go, what did I do in my life? Was I actually the person that I wanted to be? You know? So going back to that goal setting, really important. But also this kind of stuff helps you understand like why certain societies organize themselves the way they are. For example, like a lot of religious societies will basically have God as this like almost infallible, omnipotent character, and they're willing to overlook certain things that are clearly dichotomous to that. For example, like you can't, like in Christianity, you have the concept of free will. They're like, okay, free will is a thing. But then they also have an omnipotent God, right? And if you're omnipotent, that means you know everything, right? And if you know everything, that means you can't have free will because God already knows what you're going to do before you do it, right? But they're willing to ignore that for the higher ideal that, oh, this is what godliness looks like. This is what, the perfect overlap of these Venn diagrams looks like, where, the ideal self is the self, right? And that's fine. But you also see it done in certain other countries. For example, in Britain, right here, like I live in London, we have a constitutional monarchy. Okay. And the reason they have that, well, yeah, there's a historical reason. It kind of allowed the separation of God and politics, right? Or this ideal and politics, because you don't have to look to your politician to be the ideal. You kind of take it for granted that your politician is going to have, human corruption to an extent. But you look to the Queen as the infallible, the ideal, the certain thing that's like, oh, they're as close to godliness or the ideal self as possible, right? And that's a really good concept, the separation of those two things in society, because then you actually have a much more orderly way to run politics versus, for example, America, where they deify their like political leaders and they want their political leader to represent this ideal self, and they're humans. Obviously they don't. Now, obviously the Queen is also a human, but, or some people think she's a lizard person, but we won't talk about those. She's a human, so she still falls to these human related issues, fallacies, whatever. But we're still able to kind of dissociate that and go, okay, this is the ideal that we're aiming towards. That's why, for example, Canada still have the monarch as that ideal, because again, it serves that function of, oh, this is a higher ideal.
Yes, sir.
Fantastic.
God save the Queen.
See, again, the Queen is supposedly God. She's God's representative on earth,
Yep.
Anyway, look, the reason we covered all of that stuff before we actually dig into this discussion is because you kind of need that framework to understand high yield health practices, right? Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about health management. We're talking about what are the ideal like health practices that you can engage in that are really high yield, that actually allow you to get higher and higher on that kind of self-actualization and actually become this ideal self, right? And the way we do that is manifold, as we discussed on that kind of what is health, like what are we actually aiming towards. We're looking at that kind of fully integrated human, and we're looking at it from the perspective of we want to maximize the intensity of living to whatever extent we can, but also maximize the duration of living. Like we don't want to, I don't know, live like a hermit and go, oh, I can't go out anywhere in case like I get hit by a bus or, I get sick from a virus or a pathogen or whatever. You want to be able to be resilient, and you're able to do the things that you actually enjoy doing, but also you don't want to do stuff that's just pleasurable in the moment that then sets you up to die young, right? And obviously you want to be able to live vigorously into your old age. Like I don't think anybody listening to this is like, oh yeah, I cannot wait till I'm 65 and I need a walker, I need, I can't get out of a seat, I need someone to wipe my ass. I don't think anyone is in that position where they're like, that's what I want and I want it to happen as soon as possible. Most people are like, what, I would rather be a 65-year-old that is able to do all the things that they like to do. They're able to go enjoy activities, they're able to walk up a mountain, whatever it is, right? Like they want to be a resilient person for the vast majority of their life. So what are the health practices that we can engage in to facilitate that, right? Well, We're going to quickly go over the foundational stuff that, you know, most people are aware of. We talk about it all the time. We're not going to labor the point. We're not going to spend too much time talking about this stuff, because you can go back and listen to the fucking first 180 episodes of the podcast and you'll get a lot of this stuff repeated.